Hello guys, my name is Nash. Welcome to Thursday Tales of Terror. TTT. Today's case we'll be discussing about the Braemar Hill murders that happened in Hong Kong. I'm actually quite surprised that there's not much coverage about this case on YouTube, but Ashwin sent me an email requesting for me to talk about this story, so thank you for suggesting. The victims were two British teenagers. They were a very sweet couple, and it's definitely not a planned murder, but it just so happened that the couple was at the wrong place at the wrong time. The murder was extremely brutal and gruesome, and it took place at Braemar Hill, a luxury residential area and beauty spot which was an unlikely scene for a crime. This case sparked one of the largest investigations in the city's history, putting immense pressure on police to solve one of Hong Kong's most vicious crimes. After about 6 months, the killers were caught and they turned out to be as young as their victims. Why did they target the couple, and how did they get caught in the end? Let's find out. On a Saturday afternoon, 20th April 1985, 17-year-old Kenneth Mcbride and his 18-year-old girlfriend Nicola Myers were heading to Braemar Hill after they left from Kenneth Place, which was nearby Braemar Hill Mansions. At the time, Kenneth had a broken collarbone and his left arm had to be in a sling due to a cycling accident. Because they were familiar with the area, they knew of a quiet place that was only a short walk away. They wanted to study for their upcoming exams. But their family started to worry when they failed to return home that night. Kenneth's father was so worried sick that he went to search for them at the hillside at 1 a.m. But he couldn't find them anywhere. There were no signs of the teenagers at all. He searched for them again in the morning, and eventually Kenneth's parents decided to report them as missing when they found one of his school books on the grass. The police were going to launch an official search for Kenneth and Nicola, but before they could, later that morning, their bodies were found by a stranger. On the 21st of April 1985, a bank manager who was jogging in the area saw two badly beaten bodies lying on the hillside. Officers were immediately alerted and they arrived at the scene as fast as they could. Kenneth and Nicola were beaten, tortured and murdered. Kenneth had more than 100 visible wounds on his body with bruises across his neck. His hands and feet were bound and his Nike sport shoes were missing. Nicola, on the other hand, was found partially naked. She had been raped. Her body had over 500 wounds, a result of a prolonged and brutal attack. Kenneth and Nicola's death sparked a huge police hunt, one of the largest in Hong Kong. Because it was a hillside with not too many pathways, around 400 men were dispatched to comb the area to find as much evidence as they could. Just a side note, I know some sources stated that about 600 to 800 men were dispatched, but I took this statement directly from Detective Trevor Collins himself during an interview. Now, the bodies couldn't be carried down from the hill as it was too difficult and the location was quite remote too, so Kenneth and Nicola's bodies had to be flown off the hillside by a helicopter. The bodies were taken to the British Military Hospital, and from there the bodies were transported to the Victoria Public Mortuary where their post-mortem was held the next day. At this point, alongside the detective, 3 squadrons of the police tactical unit were also scouring the hillside for evidence. It was challenging because there were many trees and bushes and lots of rubbish too. But the police made sure that every possible inch was covered going from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill, and that took about 3 to 4 days. There were a lot of items found in a small stream which runs close to where their bodies were found, down to the back of Braemar Hill Mansions. The items included a lot of their school books, exercise books, and they were mostly torn. The scale of the search and the widespread media coverage of the case threatened to add racial and political dimension to the investigation. A lot of people, particularly the Chinese media, started saying that the only reason why the police were so interested and invested in this case was because the victims were 2 white kids. Would the same level of attention and investigation be given if the victims were Chinese? One netizen who was a blogger even commented, "Can you imagine the government going to all this trouble if it had been a couple of Chinese kids from a public housing estate in Kowloon?" Because of this case, the police were accused of racism and many complained about the unnecessary level of spending and use of manpower on the case. "We didn't do it because they were expatriates. We would have done exactly the same even if they had been locals," said Detective Trevor Collins. Kenneth and Nicola's family were living comfortably in Hong Kong. The teenage couple attended island school and they were well known on campus and shared common interests. Kenneth was president of the Students' Union and captain of the rowing team. He was also a poet who wrote about the love of his life, Nicola. Nicola was described as a very beautiful girl with big brown eyes and wavy hair. She was a really smart girl and she had an interest in languages and was hoping to become an interpreter. A former schoolmate of theirs by the name of Simon said that they were both very close and they had a very strong relationship. It's one of those relationships where you can see them lasting all the way through. Students, teachers and staff of Island School couldn't believe it when they got to know of Kenneth and Nicola's death. They were extremely shocked by how brutal the murder was and they were hurt tremendously by the whole incident. Meanwhile, the police were having trouble finding useful evidence to capture the killers. A lack of good evidence and the remote location provided little for detectives to work with. There were also no eyewitnesses to this case, but nevertheless, they continued searching. As a result of their intensive search, they discovered 3 pieces of wood they suspected were used as weapons. Fingerprints were found on some of the broken wood and other prints had been found on school books torn up by the killers. However, forensic technology was still in its early stage of development at the time, hence they were unable to find any matches. Police were able to recover semen and some blood samples from Nicola's body along with her ripped clothing. These were major pieces of evidence discovered at the scene, but because DNA testing wasn't available at the time, the fluid samples did not help much with the investigation. According to reports, despite Kenneth having a broken collarbone at that time, he had tried his best to fight off the attackers. The Chinese media outlets revealed that Kenneth had been strung up, beaten and strangled with the arm sling that he was wearing. Both him and Nicola were beaten brutally with branches. A stick and a bottle was thrust into Nicola's genitalia and her jaw was broken. And if that's not horrible enough, her left eyeball was out of its socket. Nicola had an expression of terrible suffering on her face. The police now knew they were looking for more than one person. The investigation team then decided to cast their nets wider. They went to every single police station in Hong Kong. Any stop or search that has been conducted by any police officer involving 2 or more people, they would try to get details of those people and question them. They even conducted door-to-door inquiries. At this point, the police interviewed about 18,000 people as well as known triad members, but nothing was found. Because the investigation team was interviewing tens of thousands of people, information kept coming in and they had no efficient way of processing the vast quantities of data resulting from their investigation. Detective Trevor Collins then decided to fly to London to look at the computer system that allowed the team to compile and view information from multiple crime scenes. It definitely helped to speed things up. Data produced by the new system was used to pinpoint suspects and key locations. With it, they were able to narrow down 18,000 people interviewed to 180 possible suspects, but they were still not any closer to solving the murders. Even a police reward for Hong Kong $50,000 amounted to nothing. A few months after the murders, an anonymous Chinese businessman donated Hong Kong $500,000 to the Hong Kong police as a reward for anyone with sufficient information about the murders. This led to a tip that unlocked the case. It was extremely uncommon for a private individual to come up with a large reward, but it was because of the reward that the case generated a lot of interest. Because of the huge amount, police received all sorts of information about the case. Surprisingly, the tip came from a known underworld figure. He was a prominent figure of a well-known triad called Fuk Yi Hing. Apparently, one of the killers had gone to him asking for financial help because he was involved with the Braemar Hill murders. Tempted by the cash payout, he decided to tip off the police. In a subsequent meeting, the triad told the detective that one of his followers by the name of Pang Shun Yi had confessed that he had killed Kenneth and Nicola. I don't think it's surprising at all to betray one of your members when money is involved. Although it's said that gang members have their code of loyalty and that they should always have each other's backs, this tip-off definitely proved that sometimes money comes before loyalty. In November 1985, the police launched an operation to find 24-year-old Pang Shun-yi, the alleged killer. The police took several weeks to track him down. After he got arrested and over the course of several interviews, Pang Shun-yi confessed his parts in the murders and gave police the name of 4 accomplices. By 11:30, the following night, the 4 accomplices were all arrested. They were Tam Zi-fun, Chu Wai-man, Cheong Yao-hang, and Won Sam-lang, and 2 of them were only teenagers, younger than their victims. The police also found a pair of Nike sport shoes with Tam Zi-fun, exactly the same as Kenneth. It was certain that the 5 of them were the murderers, but because the evidences they found when searching the Braemar Hill were unable to link them to the crime so far, the police needed more before going to court. The only way for the police to have a strong case against all 5 is to get a confession. The suspects were kept in different police stations and they were interviewed on numerous occasions over weeks. Apart from minor crimes, they were unknown to the police. According to Detective Trevor Collins, the suspects were all very remorseful. They had never been involved in such a heinous crime before and they were all very upset. They were very sorry for the families and they didn't mean for it to happen. It just did and it was very unfortunate. It was reported that Cheong Yao-hang was abandoned by his family at age 4 and was placed in an orphanage at age of 6. As a teenager, he was taken back in by his abusive father. Cheong Yao-hang then dropped out of school at 14, subsequently working menial jobs in restaurants and opening ferry doors. Upon losing his job, he was disowned by his father and was wandering the streets when he was recruited by Pang Shun-yi. Won Sam-lang, on the other hand, was a cook at a local restaurant. Nothing much was reported about the rest of the triad members. All 5 suspects in fact confessed in the police interviews. According to Won Sam-lang, he and 2 of the others were opening car doors to find money on the day of the attack. Pang Shun-yi was the leader of their group. Even though he was the leader of that group, he was still considered a low level in the Fuk-yi-hing triad. He had also been living in a wooden hut nearby Braemar Hill, and so he knew the area well. He suggested that they steal a cable from the government aerial station on the mountain for some extra cash. After several failed attempts to steal the cable, they decided to find someone to rob. And that's when they spotted Kenneth and Nicola. They thought that since Kenneth and Nicola were Europeans, they must be rich. Pang Shun-yi then split the gang up so they can approach them in 2 directions. It was very unfortunate that the teenage couple only had $1 on them. The gang didn't believe them, and somehow from there, it turned into a fight. The gang obviously overpowered them. But from what we know so far, Pang Shun-yi, the leader of the group, was definitely the instigator. They also confirmed the broken wooden handle found in the stream was the murder weapon and was picked up by Pang Shun-yi prior to the attack. Kenneth was savagely beaten, his hands and feet tied up. Tam Zi-fun had pulled off Kenneth's Nike shoes and took them. Kenneth was eventually asphyxiated with a wooden handle. After Kenneth was dead, Pang Shun-yi moved on to Nicola. He started raping her. While he was raping her, the others still had time to smoke cigarettes but stayed close. Because the teenagers had already seen the gang members' faces, Pang Shun-yi didn't want to keep them alive. After killing Kenneth and Nicola, the 5 of them went to scatter their belongings in a stream and on the hillside. They wanted to destroy any evidence. According to their statements, Pang Shun-yi verbally threatened the other 4 to take part in the attack so that they would all be involved. As part of the interrogation process, all 5 voluntarily took part in reenactments at the actual crime scene. All of it was recorded on video and used in court, which was relatively a new concept at that time. Despite confessing in police interviews and reenacting the crime on video, all of them pleaded not guilty. But in September 1986, while in custody, the youngest member, Won Sam-lang, changed his mind and admitted his guilt and agreed to give evidence against the others. Won Sam-lang was only 15 at the time of the murder. He became the star witness for the prosecution. Because of his age, he was ordered to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which meant detention in prison for an indefinite length of time. The prosecution presented 150 exhibits, including 18 bundles of photograph, audio, and video of the accused, the murder weapon, and items of clothing. There were also 37 witnesses, including 15-year-old Won Sam Lang, who confessed his parts in the killings. During the trial, it was revealed that Nicola Myers had died of multiple wounds, brain hemorrhage, and cerebral contusion. Kenneth, on the other hand, had died of asphyxiation after a wooden handle had been forced across his neck. An important piece of evidence was the pair of Nike shoes. They were taken from Kenneth by Tam Zi-fun and later seized by police in his possession. At 6:05 p.m. on January 20th, after 56 days and having deliberated for 5 hours, the jury returned to court with unanimous guilty verdicts. Pang Shun-yi, Tam Zi-fun, and Chu Wai-man were sentenced to death, but Hong Kong court had not executed a convict in years, and so their sentences were automatically commuted to life imprisonment. Since Chong Yao-hang was under 18 at the time of the crime, he was ordered to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure like Won Sam Lang. In memory of the teenage couple and their desire to help the needy, Island School, together with family and friends of the couple, established the Nicola Myers and Kenneth Mcbride Memorial Fund. This fund would support the underprivileged students in Hong Kong. While both families now live in the UK, the fund continued to help up to 100 underprivileged students every year. As for the killers, the leader of the gang, Pang Shun-yi, is still in prison along with his accomplice, Chu Wai-man. Tam Zi-fun, who stole Kenneth's Nike shoes, died of cancer in 2009 in prison. He was 45 years old. After the handover from the British to the Chinese in 1997, the law allowing underage offenders to be held indefinitely was amended. The law required Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa to determine the terms of Won Sam Lang and Chong Yao-hang. Won Sam Lang's parents appealed to the Mcbride and Myers families for forgiveness for their son. In 1998, the families announced that they had forgiven Won Sam Lang and even appealed to Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa for a lesser sentence. He agreed and decided that Won Sam Lang would be incarcerated for 27 years and Chong Yao-hang for a minimum of 30 years. After Won Sam Lang was released from prison in 2004, he was surrounded by the media. He made an emotional public apology. He is thankful towards Kenneth and Nicola's family for being forgiving, and he knows he is not able to compensate them for what they have lost, and he is truly sorry. He also admitted that he once contemplated suicide while in prison, claiming he had recurring nightmares of the murders, but it had ceased after Mr. Mcbride had written a request for his release. He added, "I found it hard to understand being forgiven. It shocked me, but it also told me that love can change a person." I'm not very certain about this part, but some sources said that Won Sam Lang was later offered clerical work in a law firm through the government's Criminal Rehabilitation Service. With a change in law in 2004, Chong Yao-hang's prison term was to be redetermined by the court. In 2005, his sentence was converted to a sentence of 35 years in prison. Later, Chong Yao-hang appealed to the court for a lesser sentence similar to Won Sam Lang, but on 6 April 2006, the verdict came down denying his request, citing that due to the heinous nature of the crime, 35 years for him was more than generous. Chong Yao-hang was released in December 2007 and was later hired as an inspection worker at a public utility. And so we have come to an end for today's case story. The Myers and Mcbride families have remained close even after the tragedy. The only time the Myers returned to Hong Kong after the murders was to attend the wedding of Kenneth's sister. It's very rare for families to forgive and in this case even appeal for the killer's release. It's very unfortunate that 2 innocent lives were lost just because they were at the wrong place at the wrong time. So people, please stay safe. Until then, I'll see you guys again next Thursday.